Charles, have you ever stopped to think that some of the most powerful figures in the Bible are not the ones who stand in the spotlight, but the ones who move silently behind the scenes, making decisions that reshape everything without anyone realizing it in that exact moment? Toby, you mean someone whose actions change the course of history without being recognized as the main figure? Charles, exactly. Someone whose name is known, but whose impact is deeply underestimated. Someone who didn't lead armies, didn't sit on a throne, didn't command nations, and yet influenced a destiny that would affect generations. Toby, who are we talking about? Charles, Rebecca. Toby, the wife of Isaac. Charles, yes, but that description alone is already too small, because if you only see her as Isaac's wife, you miss everything that actually makes her one of the most intriguing figures in the entire narrative. Toby, so what makes her story different? Charles, the fact that it doesn't begin with conflict, but with a quiet decision that seems ordinary, almost invisible, and yet carries the weight of everything that will come later. Toby, how does it start? Charles, with a journey, with a mission, with a servant sent far away with a purpose that he himself could not fully control. Toby, Abraham's servant. Charles, yes, sent to find a wife for Isaac, but not just any woman, someone who would fit into a promise that was already unfolding. Something larger than family, larger than culture, larger than personal preference. Toby, but how do you find someone like that? Charles, that's exactly the question the servant asked himself, and instead of relying on logic alone, he did something that defines the entire moment. He prayed. Toby, and asked for a sign. Charles, not just any sign, a very specific one, the woman who would offer him water, and then willingly go further and draw water for his camels. That would be the one. Toby, that sounds simple, but also very intentional. Charles, because it wasn't about beauty or status or even words. It was about action, about character, about what a person does when no one is watching. Toby, and then Rebecca appears. Charles, at exactly that moment, as if timing itself was part of the story. She comes, she sees the stranger, and she does exactly what was asked in prayer. Toby, without knowing anything about him. Charles, without knowing who he was, where he came from, or what this moment would lead to. And that is what makes it powerful, because sometimes the decisions that define our lives happen before we even understand their meaning. Toby, so her first defining moment was an act of kindness. Charles, more than kindness, it was initiative, awareness, and willingness to go beyond what was expected. Toby, and that was enough to change everything. Charles, it was the beginning, because what follows is even more revealing. Once the servant realizes that his prayer has been answered, everything moves forward quickly. Conversations happen, gifts are given, and then comes the question that changes her life. Toby, will you go? Charles, exactly. And this is where most people overlook something crucial, because saying yes in that moment was not a small decision. It meant leaving everything familiar behind. Toby, her home, her family, her world. Charles, everything, for a future she had never seen, for a man she had never met, for a life she could not predict. Toby, that requires a level of trust that is hard to imagine. Charles, or courage, or maybe a combination of both, because stepping into the unknown is something most people avoid. Toby, and she didn't hesitate. Charles, that's what makes it even more striking. She didn't delay, she didn't ask for guarantees, she moved forward. Toby, and then she meets Isaac. Charles, yes, and from the outside, everything seems to settle into place. The marriage happens, the story continues, and it almost feels like everything is resolved. Toby, but that's not where the real story begins. Charles, exactly, because the most important conflicts in life rarely start in public. They start in silence, in waiting, in questions that don't have immediate answers. Toby, what do you mean? Charles, Rebecca doesn't immediately become a mother, and in a story where legacy and promise are central, that matters. Toby, so there is a period of waiting. Charles, yes, and waiting has a way of revealing what is inside a person, because when things don't happen quickly, doubts begin to form, questions become louder, and expectations feel heavier. Toby, and eventually she becomes pregnant. Charles, yes, but instead of relief, something unexpected happens. something that shifts the entire direction of her story. Toby, the struggle inside her. Charles. Exactly, the text describes it as a struggle, just movement, not just discomfort, but something that feels like conflict, even before the children are born. Toby, that must have been unsettling Charles, enough for her to seek an answer, because when something doesn't make sense, you look for meaning. Toby, and she receives an answer. Charles. Yes, and it's not a simple one, it's a revelation that changes everything she will ever think about her children. Toby, what was she told? Charles. That two nations were inside her, that two peoples would come from her, and that the older would serve the younger. Toby, that reverses everything. Charles. Exactly, because the natural order would have been the opposite. The firstborn carries the weight, the authority, the inheritance. Toby, but now she knows something different. Charles. And that knowledge becomes a seed. Something that grows over time, something that doesn't disappear. Toby. And that influences how she sees her sons. Charles. It has to. Because once you know something like that, you cannot unknow it. You begin to interpret everything through that lens. Toby. So when the children are born. Charles, the differences are clear. Esau is strong, direct, physical, a man of the field, while Jacob is quieter, more observant, more calculated. Toby, and their parents see them differently. Charles. Yes, Isaac leans toward Esau, Rebekah toward Jacob. And this is where something subtle begins to grow. Toby, division. Charles. Not open conflict, but a quiet separation. A difference in perspective that slowly shapes the environment. Toby, and that kind of tension builds over time. Charles. Exactly. It doesn't explode immediately. It develops, it deepens. It becomes part of the structure of the family. Toby. And then comes the moment with the birthright. Charles. Yes, Esau returns exhausted and trades something valuable for something immediate. Toby. He gives up his birthright. Charles. And that moment reveals something important about his character. He acts quickly, without considering long-term consequences. Toby, and Rebekah sees this. Charles. Whether directly or indirectly, it reinforces what she already carries inside her. The idea that Jacob is the one tied to something greater. Toby, and that belief grows stronger. Charles. Yes, and this is where belief can become dangerous, because when someone is convinced of an outcome, they may begin to feel responsible for making it happen. Toby, instead of trusting the process. Charles. Exactly, and that brings us to the turning point. Isaac grows old, his vision fades, and he decides it is time to give his blessing. Toby, to Esau. Charles. Naturally, yes, because he is the firstborn, and this is where everything collides, because Rebekah hears this. Toby, and realizes what is about to happen. Charles, and in that moment, everything she has known, everything she has believed, everything she has carried inside her rises to the surface. Toby, and she makes a decision. Charles. A decisive one, immediate, without hesitation. She doesn't wait, she acts. Toby, she creates a plan. Charles. Yes, and not a small adjustment, but a full intervention. She prepares the food, takes Esau's garments, covers Jacob's skin, constructs a moment that will redirect the outcome. Toby, that is intense. Charles, and this is where her story becomes impossible to ignore, because now the question is unavoidable. Toby, was she right? Charles, or did she cross a line? Toby, was it faith or control? Charles, and that is why her story continues to provoke, because it doesn't offer a simple answer. It forces you to think, to question, to examine what you would do in the same situation. Toby, and Jacob goes in. Charles. Yes, carrying not just a disguise, but the weight of everything that is about to change. Toby, and Isaac hesitates. Charles. Multiple times. Because something feels off, the voice doesn't match the hands. The moment is unsteady, uncertain. Toby, and yet the blessing is given. Charles. Yes, and once spoken, it cannot be undone. And in that exact moment, everything shifts, not just for Jacob, not just for Esau, but for Rebekah as well, because the decision she made has now moved from intention into reality. And once something becomes real, it begins to create consequences that cannot be avoided. And this is exactly where her story begins to reveal its deepest layers, because what comes next is not quiet, not controlled, not predictable, and not something she can simply manage the way she managed the moment before, because now, the outcome has been released, and everything that follows will test not only the decision itself, but the cost of making it. Toby. And it is exactly at that point, when everything seems already decided, that the story truly begins to reveal its weight. Because a decision is one thing, but what comes after that decision is something entirely different. Something that cannot be undone. Something that unfolds in ways no one fully anticipates. Charles. Yes. Because most people focus on the moment of the blessing, but they don't stop to think about what follows. And what follows is where everything becomes real, where everything begins to show its consequences. Toby. And the first reaction comes from Esau. Charles. Exactly. And his reaction is not mild, not controlled, not something that can be easily dismissed. It is raw, it is emotional, it is a deep cry that reveals not just anger, but loss. Toby. Loss of what, Charles? Not just a blessing, but identity, position, expectation. Everything he believed was his suddenly shifts, and that kind of loss is not easy to process. Toby. And that changes the entire atmosphere. Charles. Completely. Because now the tension that was hidden becomes visible, what was internal becomes external, and everyone is forced to face it. Toby. And Rebecca is right in the center of that. Charles. Yes. And this is where her story changes direction. Because she is no longer the one creating the plan, she becomes the one reacting to the consequences of the plan. Toby. And that requires a different kind of thinking. Charles. Exactly. Because planning happens in control, but reacting happens under pressure. Toby. And pressure reveals things. Charles. It reveals priorities, instincts, fears, and in Rebecca's case, it reveals how quickly she can shift from strategy to protection. Toby. Because now, Jacob is in danger. Charles. Yes. Because Esau's reaction goes beyond anger, moves toward intention, toward a desire for revenge. Toby. And that creates urgency. Charles. Immediate urgency. Because now, time is not something that can be stretched. Decisions must be made quickly. Toby. And once again, Becca acts. Charles. Yes. And this is consistent with her character. She does not freeze. She does not hesitate. She moves. Toby. She sends Jacob away. Charles. Exactly. And this moment is one of the most important in understanding her story, because it shows the cost of everything that came before. Toby. The son she protected now has to leave. Charles. And not just leave for a short time, but leave without certainty of return. Toby. That is a heavy consequence. Charles. Very heavy. Because protection now looks like separation. Toby. And that changes everything. Charles. Yes. Because up until now, her actions were about securing something. But now they are about preserving what remains. Toby. And that shift is significant. Charles. It shows that every decision, even when driven by conviction, carries layers that unfold over time. Toby. And what about Isaac? Charles. Isaac stands in a complex position, because he has already spoken the blessing, but he is also confronted with the reality of what has happened. Toby. So he cannot reverse it. Charles. No. And that is what makes this moment so powerful, because it shows that some things, once spoken, once done, cannot simply be undone. Toby. And that adds weight to every decision. Charles. Exactly. Because it forces you to consider not just what you want to achieve, but what you are willing to risk. Toby. And Rebecca risked a lot. Charles. She did. And now, she begins to experience the full impact of that risk. Toby. Do you think she expected things to unfold this way? Charles. That is one of the most difficult questions, because when people act with strong conviction, they often focus on the outcome they desire, not on the path that leads there. Toby. So she may not have fully considered the cost. Charles. Or she may have considered it and still decided it was worth it. Toby. And that makes her even more complex. Charles. Exactly. Because she is not acting blindly, she is acting with intention, but intention does not eliminate consequence. Toby. And that is something many people struggle with, Charles. Yes, because it is easy to justify an action when you believe the end is right, but it is much harder to accept the cost when it arrives, Toby. And in her case, the cost is separation, tension, and uncertainty, Charles. And possibly something deeper, something internal, something that changes how she sees herself, Toby. Because decisions shape identity, Charles. They do, especially when they carry weight, when they affect others, when they leave marks that cannot be erased, Toby. And what happens to Esau, Charles? He remains in the story as someone who has been deeply affected, someone whose reaction continues to influence what happens next, Toby. So the impact of this moment continues beyond the immediate situation, Charles. Yes, it ripples outward, affecting relationships, shaping future events, creating a chain of consequences, Toby. And that is what makes this story so powerful, Charles. Because it is not isolated, it connects to everything that follows, Toby. And when we look at it from a modern perspective, Charles, we begin to see parallels. Because people today still face decisions where they must choose between waiting and acting, Toby. And often they feel pressure to act, Charles. Yes, especially when they believe something important is at stake, Toby. And that is where the tension lies, Charles. Exactly. Between trust and control. Between patience and urgency, Toby. And Rebecca chose control, Charles, at least in that moment. Yes, and that choice shaped everything that followed, Toby. Do you think things would have been different if she had waited, Charles? That is a question that cannot be answered definitively, because we only see one version of events, the one that unfolded, Toby. But the question itself is powerful, Charles, because it forces reflection. It makes people consider their own decisions, their own tendencies, Toby. And that is why the story still resonates, Charles. Yes, because it is not just about what happened, it is about what it reveals about human nature, Toby. About fear, about conviction, about action, Charles. And about the complexity of living in a world where not everything is clear, where decisions must be made with incomplete understanding, Toby. And that is something everyone can relate to, Charles. Exactly. Because no one has perfect clarity. No one sees the full picture. And yet decisions still have to be made, Toby. And those decisions have consequences, Charles. Always. And that is one of the central themes of this story. That every action carries weight, even when it is driven by belief, Toby. And that weight does not disappear, Charles. It transforms. It spreads. It influences what comes next, Toby. And in Rebecca's case, it defines her legacy, Charles. Yes, because she is remembered not just for what she believed, but for what she did, Toby. And that raises an important question, Charles. What matters more, intention or action, Toby? And the answer is not simple, Charles. No, it is not, because both play a role. Both shape the outcome, Toby. And that is what makes her story so compelling, Charles. It does not give easy answers. It invites deeper thinking. It challenges assumptions, Toby. And it stays with you, Charles. Exactly. Because once you understand the layers, you realize that this is not just a story about one woman. It is a story about decision-making, about the tension between what we believe should happen and what we choose to do about it, Toby. And that tension exists in every generation, Charles. Yes. And perhaps that is why her story continues to be told. Because it reflects something universal, something timeless, something that goes beyond culture and era, Toby. And the more you think about it, Charles, the more you begin to see that her actions, her choices, her consequences are not distant. They are close. They are familiar. They are part of the human experience, Toby. And that is what makes it powerful, Charles. Exactly. Because it moves from being a story you hear to a story you feel. A story that asks you what you would do, how you would respond, whether you would wait or act, whether you would trust or take control. And in that moment of reflection, you begin to understand that this is not just about Rebecca. It is about anyone who has ever stood at a crossroads, faced with a decision that could change everything, decision that cannot be undone, a decision whose consequences will unfold over time, shaping not only the future, but the person making it.